And welcome back for episode number 32 of Thursdays with Charlie. Here it is, the 10th of December. We're 15 days out from Christmas. We're doing our show. Obviously, you've all heard the news over in California that they put a lockdown in effect, which is in effect for 3 weeks, trying to keep people within their homes and closing restaurants, even for outside dining. Of course, churches can have no inside services at all. But the 3 weeks, strangely, expire just days after Christmas. It's as if it's almost in place just to make sure Christmas stays under control. I think that's somewhat unfortunate. Of course, the production of movies and television shows and professional sports, those can all go on because those are deemed to be essential in California. But religion apparently is not considered anywhere near as essential, nor are restaurants for that matter. We're going to have to see, what that plays out as we get closer to Christmas and how it affects what's going to be happening here in our state of Nevada. I looked at the numbers on Monday of this week, and the numbers for this week on Monday, Nevada had 2,447 new cases on Monday. Arizona had 1,557 new cases on Monday. And California had 24,155,000 new cases on Monday. So the numbers continue to rise. Of course, California's rise is incredible given the fact that they've had almost consistent lockdowns since the beginning of March. We're not sure how that is going to play out, and we're waiting for word from our governor this weekend, so I'll have more to tell you on that next week. I do have one announcement for next week that does not depend on the governor or on the virus. As you know, our Garces Center is coming along beautifully. It's just about complete. And one of the things that will complete the whole picture of it will be the redoing of the parking lot. The parking lot needs to be repaved by the church, by the Garces Center, all around through it, and has to be repainted so we have those nice bright white lines so people can easily park their cars. So the parking lot is going to be redone next week, repaved, repainted. So we will not, I repeat, we will not be able to have Mass at the church on Monday and Tuesday of this coming week. So please be prepared, especially if you're interested in coming to daily Mass. We will not have Mass at the church on the 14th and the 15th of December, Monday and Tuesday. Those Mass intentions, I will say the Mass privately at home, so the Mass intentions will be said if you have made an intention for one of those Masses, but they will not be at church because there'll be no place to park the cars. We'll be taking care of the parking lot. It will look absolutely beautiful when it's redone and restriped and has the nice bright white lines on the really dark blacktop. Be really easy to park. So we will resume Mass at the church after the Masses on Sunday. The next one will be on Friday morning at 8 a.m. Again, keep that in mind. Monday and Tuesday, 14th and 15th, there will be no Masses at the church. Now, we're trying to make out our Christmas schedule to be prepared for what it's going to be like. We're not sure how that's going to play out because we don't know what the governor is going to decide yet. But presuming that we are going to stay with the current situation of 50 people, we're planning on having 6 Masses for Christmas. 3 of them on Christmas Eve and 3 of them on Christmas Day. So our plan is to have Mass on Christmas Eve, that's Thursday, December 24th, here at the church at 4 o'clock, at 6 o'clock, and at 8 o'clock in the evening. On Christmas Day, that's Friday, December 25th, the plan is to have 3 Masses at 8 a.m., at 10 a.m., and at 12 noon. Now, that considered, we can get 50 people if the situation stays the same. That would allow us to have 300 people at the Mass. We may be able to utilize the Garces Center by having a video feed into it. If we're allowed to put 50 people in there, that would double our capacity, but 50 people at each Mass would be viewing the Mass on a large screen TV, and then we would send over one of the deacons or an extraordinary minister of communion, and we would provide communion to those who are viewing it in the Garces Center. We'll have to see how that plays out. Again, we will know more on that next week, but that is our plan for it to be. You might have heard things on the news about the Christmas star. There's going to be an alignment of the planets, I believe Saturn and Jupiter, on December 21st, which is going to be visible to the naked eye and be a really bright scene in the sky. Some astronomers have said this is likely what happened when the Christmas star was visible at the birth of Jesus. Now, the last time that configuration of planets lined up was in 1226, back in the days of St. Francis of Assisi, who, by the way, was the one who invented the idea of a Christmas scene, the Christmas creche or stable and setting. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that next week. We'll know more about the timing of the star in the sky. We'll know more about our Christmas schedule. And we'll want to talk a little bit more. In fact, I'm planning to do 2 shows coming up, which will have a little bit of information about Christmas customs from various nationalities and parts of the country, maybe even some Christmas recipes and things going on. So look forward to those 2 shows coming up. Right now, I want to ask you, please remember our Colorado River Food Bank, whether you're collecting food to bring over, making up a box of goodies to bring over to them, whether you're bringing frozen pies over to them, please, by the 17th of December, that's a week from today, they need to have whatever foods they're going to be distributing for Christmas. So please get them over. They're at Laughlin Civic Drive, right up the street from the Riverside Casino, and they're open from 9 until 3 p.m. on Monday through Friday. They would appreciate very, very much receiving whatever you can bring, whether it be food or cash donations, pies, wonderful things for them to distribute and give out. They do wonderful work in our community, and we're very grateful for them. We received several good questions for this week. I always enjoy the question section because it makes me dig into my memory and it makes me dig into research and try to find out a little more about some of the topics. And they're always interesting. I figure if one person has a question, there's probably easily 10 others in the congregation who have thought about it and never gotten around to ask it. The first question had to do with scapulars. What are they? How are they used? What are they like? And so, a brief mention. Scapulars, the word scapular comes from the Latin word scapula, which means shoulder. And the scapulars were originally aprons that were worn by religious orders. So you'd have the religious habit, the full habit that goes down to the floor, and usually had a white, maybe a collar or a piece, a bib-like thing over here, if it was the nuns. And when you were doing physical work, you wanted to protect that. And so you would wear something over it. It was usually like a straight piece of cloth that had a hole in it for your head to go on, and it had a back piece which kept it in place. And you would walk around when you were doing physical work. It was able to help keep the rest of the habit clean. And people began to say, well, gee, I would like to be associated with the works of the order. And one of the ways that it was thought to do, they did a modified version of the apron, which they came to call scapular. And it was 2 pieces of cloth, one on the front and one on the back, held by straps over the shoulders, which a person could wear. And the idea was you were wearing it because you wanted to be associated with the works of a particular religious community of men or of women. Now, over the years, there have been many variations on the scapular. In fact, there have, over the years, been 18 different versions of the scapular approved by the Church. However, out of those 18, only 6 are relatively common, and out of those 6, only one is really known to just about everybody, and that's the brown scapular of Mount Carmel. The scapular design is St. Simon's stock with Our Lady of Mount Carmel. It's 2 pieces of cloth connected by strings, so that one piece of the cloth would hang over your chest, the other one would hang over your back. It's blessed, it's considered a sacramental, and it shows your affiliation with the work of the Carmelite order, St. Simon Stock being a member of the Carmelite order. And it usually depicts a picture of Our Lady of Mount Carmel on one of the squares of cloth. The idea of a scapular being cloth is it represents a part of the religious habit, even if that part was the apron that was used during work as the order was progressing. And so scapulars became very common. People would wear them. They tend to cling to your skin. I have to admit, I was never one who liked wearing a scapular because I could always feel it being on, especially if you started to sweat, you would feel the scapular being there. So I've always gone for a medal. I wear the miraculous medal of Mary, and I've always done that for many, many years. But some people have liked the idea of scapulars. I've liked particularly the brown scapular of of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, connecting you with the work of the Carmelite order throughout the world. The second question was fascinating. It had to do with what are doctors of the Church? Now, these are not medical doctors. I would think of them more as teachers, or maybe if we want to use the term doctor, we'll think of them like the PhDs of the Church. They did something because of their research, because of their preaching, because of their writing that greatly advanced the study, the depth of theology in our Catholic Church. And looking at them, supposedly the list has been not exceptionally large, but the list does include 36 people over the years who have been declared doctors of the Church. You might recall that in the early centuries of the Church, I think I have mentioned this before, the early saints were all martyrs. They gave their lives for the Church, and that's how we knew that we would honor them as saints. But over the years, other people were honored because of what they did in the Church while they were alive, not necessarily dying as a martyr, but because they gave so much of their life and their life's work to the Church. Now, out of the list of the 36 doctors of the Church, 4 of them are women. And those 4 only became doctors of the Church after 1970. So up until 1970, all of the doctors of the Church were men. Some of them, many of whom were religious, some were popes, some were great educators within the Church, but there were no women. After 1970, 4 women were added to the role of doctors of the Church. The Pope is the one who makes the ultimate decision that someone's to be declared a doctor of the Church, and the last one was Pope Francis, who actually did it in 2015. He named a doctor of the Church. It was an Armenian scholar. Now, I went over the list of doctors of the Church, and it was funny, reading over them, I could almost immediately think of many of them, things that I had read or had studied from in my seminary years that they wrote. So they really did play an important influence in the doctrine of the Church and the theology and the preaching and the teaching of our Catholic Church. So I'm going to take the time and read over the list of the 36, bringing them to your memory. You might recall either a particular quotation from them or something in your years that you remember some priest or a nun saying they did, or maybe you yourself having read some of the works of the things. The list is in no particular order. It's not the order in which they lived necessarily. That was done at different years. Sometimes someone is named a doctor very soon after his death. and sometimes it was many centuries later that the value of his writings or his preaching were established, and that was only declared a doctor much, much later on. First, we start with St. Gregory the Great, who was a pope, and then St. Ambrose. St. Ambrose's feast we celebrated just last week. Certainly a great saint, a great preacher, the Archbishop of Milan in Italy. St. Augustine was also a doctor of the church. St. Augustine wrote The City of God and so many beautiful parts of theology. He was probably the most influential theologian in the early history of our church, writing and teaching, and as well as his preaching. St. Jerome became a doctor of the church, and you might recall St. Jerome was the one who translated the Bible from various languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, into Latin. And that's what he's honored for, as well as his commentaries on the Bible. But if it weren't for St. Jerome, we would not have the unified Bible. It was called the Vulgate, the common language Bible that we did. He spent many years of his life translating the Bible so that we could have it. St. Thomas Aquinas is also on the list of doctors of the church. Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s was probably the most enlightened person coming into the early Middle Ages as far as theology goes. And his great talent was piecing together 1,200 years of Christian theology into an organized whole, which we know as the Summa Theologica. He put it together in organized form, and that organization is still the valid way in which we discuss and consider and categorize a lot of our theology today. St. John Chrysostom, an early doctor of the church, basically for his preaching. He was actually called the golden-mouthed because he spoke so beautifully of Christ and the mysteries of the church. St. Basil the Great and St. Gregory Nazianzen, who were friends, who actually went to school together and kind of pushed one another on in their studies, vying for who could do the most, who could be the best. And they kind of vied that trying to make the other the best. There's a great friendship between Basil and Gregory that's beautiful to consider. They wanted the best for each other in their lives. St. Athanasius, who dealt with many heresies against the nature of Christ, that Christ was either not truly man or not truly God. St. Athanasius wrote and preached an awful lot on that. St. Bonaventure, one of the great lights of the Franciscan order, did a lot of writing about Mary and her role in the church. St. Anselm, a great theologian of the Middle Ages. St. Isidore, I don't know an awful lot about Isidore, but for some reason he's considered the patron saint of computers, even though he lived many centuries before computers were even developed. St. Peter Chrysologus and St. Leo the Great. St. Leo was a pope, a very famous pope and leader of our church. St. Peter Damian and St. Bernard. St. Bernard of Clairvaux was perhaps one of the greatest writers about Mary and her role in the church. St. Hilary and St. Alphonsus Liguori. St. Alphonsus Liguori, writing in the 1700s, probably had the most influence on our moral and ethical teaching of anybody, and his influence is still felt and still studied in the church today. St. Francis de Sales and St. Cyril of Alexandria, St. Cyril of Jerusalem, and St. John Damascene. Great writers, not only writers, but also great preachers in the church. St. Bede the Venerable. Bede was an historian. If it weren't for Bede, we wouldn't have much of the history of the early church recorded, unified, put into chronological order for future generations to have. St. Ephrem, who was a monk, St. Peter Canisius, a great scholar, St. John of the Cross. St. John of the Cross was a great Carmelite mystic in the 1500s in Spain. St. Robert Bellarmine, St. Albertus Magnus. Albertus Magnus was the teacher of St. Thomas Aquinas. So without St. Albertus Magnus, we probably wouldn't have the great scholar and the great scholarly wisdom of Thomas Aquinas. St. Anthony of Padua. You wouldn't think of Anthony of Padua in terms of being a great doctor of the church. We mainly remember him, but, well, he helps us find lost objects. St. Anthony, please come around. Something is lost and cannot be found. But his writings, his sermons, are very deep and very beautiful. St. Lawrence of Brindisi. And then we get to the first woman doctor of the church, St. Teresa of Avila, a Carmelite nun in the 1500s. She was the first woman to be declared a doctor of the church. And even though she lived in the 1500s and wrote in the 1500s and did all of her missionary work in the 1500s, it was only in 1970 that she was declared a doctor of the church. She was followed by St. Catherine of Siena, who did an amazing amount of work as far as trying to bring the papacy together at a time when there were 3 men claiming to be pope at the same time. Catherine of Siena did an awful lot of work as a nun to unify the church. Then St. Therese of Lisieux was the third woman named a doctor of the church. You wouldn't think of her as being a doctor of the church. She preached a little way of life, doing little things for the sake of God's kingdom, doing little things out of love for the Lord. But the church has felt that that's such an important part of our theology that she should be honored with that. And St. Joan of Arc, not because she left us a great deal of writing, but because she was a visionary, she was a mystic, she felt God and let God live on through her in so many ways. St. Hildegard, and the most recent doctor of the church, proclaimed by Pope Francis in 2015, was St. Gregory Nowak, an Arminian monk. So those are the 36 doctors of the church. Probably there will be more. They may come from future generations, or they might go back and recognize someone from a past generation whose work has just risen to prominence in our church. Our third question today has to do with the parts of the Mass. There's many ways of dividing the Mass, the liturgy, into sections or parts. The most common way, and the one that's been used for most of the time, has been 2 parts: the liturgy of the Word and the liturgy of the Eucharist. The liturgy of the Word goes from the beginning of Mass up until the end of the Gospel and the sermon. And the liturgy of the Eucharist begins with the offering of the gifts of bread and wine and goes until the end of Mass. Some of you who are older may remember that there was some discussion about what time do you have to get to Mass, and you had to make it there before the Gospel. That it was considered that you had missed Mass if you didn't at least hear the Gospel. And so I can visualize, I can remember even as a young priest, people racing to get to church, maybe not for the beginning of Mass, but they wanted to get there before the Gospel. That would mean they had gotten to the Mass. As I said, there are other ways of dividing up Mass. You can go from the prayers, the readings, the offertory. You can go for the Eucharistic prayer. You can divide it up into various ways, but those 2 parts are basically the way the church has viewed it. The liturgy of the Word, we have our readings from the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the Gospel, and usually from the book of Psalms in there too, between the readings. And then the offering of the gifts, the bread and wine, the consecration of the gifts, and the distribution of Holy Communion. Fourth question had to do with how do we deal with hypocrisy? Do as I say, not as I do. And boy, that has certainly come out now a lot dealing with the coronavirus. What do we do with politicians who put lockdowns on areas and whole ways of life? It's said that over 110,000 restaurants have already closed their doors for good in the United States because of this coronavirus and the economic effects of the lockdowns. But what do you do when, a governor closes the restaurants or limits the amount of people that can be possibly at them, and they must be meals taken out of doors, and then shows up in a fancy restaurant inside with no mask with a bunch of his friends? That's hypocrisy. What do you do with a lawmaker who lives in a city where nail salons and barber shops are shut down for safety, but insists on going and having her hair done because she needs it done? She takes good care of herself. She's a public person. Well, that's hypocrisy. Governors who have made rules that they don't follow. I think most recently we had a situation where a mayor was traveling to Cabo San Lucas, and he made a video there telling the people of his town that they should stay home and not travel. That's hypocrisy. It's very hard to deal with that. California right now, I think, is very difficult to deal with and to justify. Churches are closed. You're not allowed to have an indoor church service at all in California. Restaurants are closed. You're not allowed to eat inside a restaurant or even outside a restaurant. You can only do takeout or delivery services. And yet, California allows the film industry, the television industry, and professional sports to function. That's a little bit of hypocrisy there. If it's good for one, why isn't it good for the other? Why are those industries considered essential, yet a person's livelihood, for instance, running a restaurant, a person's religion, for which we have the First Amendment to guarantee our rights, are not considered essential? I think that that's going to be something that will be challenged more and more. I think people are noticing the hypocrisy of it and taking steps toward correcting it where possible. Our fifth question had to do with the parables of Jesus. I used to teach a course to sophomores in high school about the Bible, and I used to love when we got to the parables of Jesus, the stories that Jesus would tell to get his points across. I used to make my students memorize the fact that there were 3 reasons why Jesus used parables. And the 3 reasons were attention, retention, and reflection. Attention, retention, and reflection. Jesus told stories because people like stories. People will listen to stories even when they might not listen if you said, "Listen, I'm going to tell you something." But if you said, "I'm going to tell you a story," you get wrapped up in the story. You may notice that many times at Mass, I try to use that in my sermons. I'll tell you a story, and you may for a while wonder, what does this story have to do with anything in this Mass? And then you're listening to it, perhaps trying to find some connection or find out that I don't have a connection for it, but you're listening. And then retention, you're going to remember the story. Long after Mass, long after you read the gospel parables, you're going to remember the story, and hopefully the reflection comes in. You're going to realize that the story was designed to teach you something. That's why Jesus told stories. The apostles, the disciples, the general crowd who was listening, they heard his stories, and they would wonder about them. Why is he telling this story? What can we learn from this story? What are the parts of this story? And they'd remember the story, and hopefully they'd take it the one other step. They'd remember, well, this is why he told that story. This was the reason why it was there, the reflection on it. I think if I had to pick my favorite parables, there are 2 that are my favorite. My absolute favorite would be in St. Luke's Gospel, the parable of the prodigal son. Father had 2 sons. One son goes to his father, the younger son, and says, "Give me what would be mine when you die." And the father does it. And the kid goes off and he wastes it, he loses it, he squanders it, and then wants to come back to the father. And he comes back because he's hoping that the Father will in some way take him back. And he's surprised when the Father takes him back, not as a slave or a servant, but takes him back as a son. The one who has trouble with that is the older brother, who has not wasted what the Father has given and cannot understand the Father's generosity in wanting the younger son back. And the Father wants both of his sons. He wants the younger son who's wasted everything but has come to his senses. He wants the older son who hasn't wasted anything but can't understand the Father's generosity and genuineness and givingness to the younger son. I think that story is among the most beautiful of all the parables that Jesus told. And it's told to us in St. Luke's Gospel. My second favorite would be the parable of the sower. The man who goes out and sows seed in the field, and some of it falls on good ground, some of it falls on stony ground, some of it falls on rocks and just doesn't survive at all. And the lesson being there that we're the soil that God puts his seed into, that we're supposed to make it grow. And what are we doing to help the seed of faith that God gives us to grow? That story, by the way, the parable of the sower, shows up in 3 out of the 4 Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell the story of the sower. And Jesus must have thought that the parable of the sower was important because not only is it recorded in 3 out of the 4 Gospels, but it's explained in 3 out of the 4 Gospels. In 3 out of the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the disciples question Jesus, explain to us the parable of the sower. And in each one of them, Jesus explains it. There must be some great importance that he wants us to know our role in helping the faith he's given us to grow. Well, it's about time to talk about Paschal. Let me say a few words. People have asked, have we seen Paschal around? And no, we have not in recent weeks seen him. He has been spotted by some of our parishioners around the perimeter of the property, around the block, so he's still in the area. We keep hoping now that the work is just about finished on the Garces Center, it'll be quieter over here, that Paschal will resume his perch outside the church office. We're not sure. We're waiting for that. Meanwhile, you may have heard that we've picked up a roadrunner. A roadrunner has taken up kind of residence in our parking lot and can be seen frequently running back and forth across the front of the church, getting very near the door. I don't know if he's expecting us to provide some food for him as time goes on. So we've got 2 animals now, the Paschal the owl and the roadrunner, who is remaining unnamed because I don't have the same affection for roadrunners that I have for Paschal our owl. I should mention, as we're getting ready for Christmas, one of our parishioners made me a very beautiful owl tree out of owl material, and now I have an owl ornament hanging on it. That's going to be my office Christmas tree for this year. But now it's time for our Paschal to come on down and join us. Nice and furry. I'll put him aside. He brings us a message. And the message seems to fit very well with what we were talking about regarding hypocrisy. Many of the Roman emperors had this idea that I can do anything. I don't have to follow my own rules. And one of the most famous in that category was a Roman emperor known for his cruelty, and that was Caligula. And this is actually a quote from Caligula, the Roman emperor. And basically it's Oderint Dum Metuant. And basically it means, let them hate me as long as they fear me. I think some of our governors and mayors might have adopted that saying unknowingly. Let them hate me as long as they fear me. Their power is something that can really be dangerous if it's left unchecked. Get ready now. We're preparing for Christmas. We'll have lots of news for you next week. Hopefully we'll have some great Christmas shows coming up, and hopefully a lot of good news about what we'll be doing for our Christmas worship services. Meanwhile, God bless, God love you, and have a great week.